Hi, I'm Vivian Thompson, your host for the Human Side of Emergency Management podcast. And today, I would like to welcome Reverend Dr. Mark Layson to the show. Mark is a disaster leadership practitioner, a chaplain, and a researcher specialising in moral injury, psychosocial risk, and organisational culture in emergency context. He has over 30 years' experience across policing, fire and rescue, aeromedical chaplaincy, and disaster recovery leadership. And he currently leads one of Australia's largest chaplaincy networks supporting New South Wales and ACT communities. All of this highlights the human backbone of crisis response, that everyday behaviour values and trust can determine whether plans succeed when the pressure hits. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Vivian. It's nice to be here with you.
Thank you. On this show, we touch on many subjects: leadership, trauma, courage, community, recovery, but the one thread that runs through every conversation is the human side of this work. And that's a space that you've lived in for decades. You've been at the pointy end of emergency services, chaplains, disaster recovery and organisational culture, and you've probably seen more of the human impact than most people ever will. Your experience sits in that intersection where systems meet people, policy meets pain, and where leadership meets the moral and emotional realities that shape us. That's why I wanted to interview you today, because you understand not just what happens on the ground, but what happens inside people, leaders, communities, especially when the pressure is on and the stakes are high. But today I'd love to explore that with you, the moments that shaped you, the patterns that you've seen across organisations, the moral injuries that often go unnamed, and the way leaders can create cultures that genuinely care for their people. So Mark, again, thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we dive too far in, I just wanted to check in on something personal. I know your companion dog Wallace passed away recently, and anyone who's worked in emergency services or in this kind of emotionally demanding spaces you've spent your life in knows that a dog isn't just a pet. They're part of your emotional toolkit. They're the quiet presence that absorbs the things that you can't always say out loud. They walk with you through the aftermath of the hard days, and they anchor you when the work gets really heavy. Losing that kind of companion is its own kind of grief. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging that and asking you how you've been going and what did that relationship mean to you, not just personally, but in the context of the work that you do and the weight that you carry for others.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. Thanks for asking and taking interest in that. Wallace sat at the intersection of personal and professional life. So when he came along, particularly to work as a companion dog with me, with aeromedical in New South Wales Ambulance. And so it was much loved in that little community. So not only in our workplace, but also he lived at home with the family.
Yeah.
So he was part of our pack. And we've all felt quite a bit of sadness. It was quite sudden, actually, his passing. It wasn't something we were expecting. And it seems to be the little things you miss. Come home from a bike ride and his nose would be sticking underneath the side gate and wagging tail, and Dad doesn't greet you anymore. There's no more Labrador hair that we need to vacuum up every day, which is interesting because we always used to curse that and now we miss that. So, but we're doing okay, and there's been lots of supportive people who have been helping us through. And Wallace was a really good connector of people. Interestingly, just as you were talking then about the human side of emergency management, he was the canine side of emergency management. He had a great ability just to ease the tension. People would continually say, this is the best thing that's happened to me today.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And we worked very much as a team, that he would make a connection sometimes where it was people may have been reserved, and built trust and connection so that we could have a real conversation, human to human. So the human to human contact was sometimes as important as the human to canine. So, yeah, look, we're missing Wallace and just sort of getting our feet and restoring our equilibrium after losing him. So,
yeah.
But we're doing okay.
Thank you for sharing that, because it is so important. And they feel such an amazing space. And a couple of weeks ago, I was at the National Library with my adult children, and in the foyer there, they actually had quite a few, I guess you call them companion dogs, and they were actually reading stories. But it was quite amazing how still those children were, because they were just sitting there next to the dogs, patting them or watching them, you know, and the dogs are sometimes just walking around and sniffing and getting a pat from each of them. But it was just such a different atmosphere. I was quite surprised. And it was
Mm,
beautiful to watch too.
mm.
So I just can't imagine when you're in that space of trauma, how effective that can be as well.
Yeah, it does change people. Wallace used to come with me. I used to do some chaplaincy work in aged care, and every now and again he'd come with me. And people who would be completely non-verbal, just sitting there, all of a sudden their eyes would light up and they would talk. They would pat him, talk to me, talk to him, and then would leave. And it left a bit of an impression for quite some time. It changed their behaviour. And it is really important. Dogs are something, I think, that symbol of trust. And you've mentioned trust a couple of times already, that symbol of trust, which is actually why it's really important working with a dog to recognise it's a team
Yeah. Yeah.
and to be very aware of the people that you have if it's in a workplace who are working as a team with that dog as well. You don't want someone who loves dogs and hates people to work with a companion dog in a workplace or in a high stress place. You need someone who loves people and loves dogs as well to connect with people so that you can really build an ongoing bond and a greater bond and a greater sense of support from both a canine and a human who is attached to him.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I just want to ask you a little bit about your 3 decades. So as I mentioned, you've spent over 3 decades across policing, fire and rescue, area medical chaplaincy and disaster recovery. What thread ties all that work together for you? Because I know they're all very different, but I can't think what that saying is, very different but same.
Yeah, I think particularly when I worked as an Anglican minister for 15 years as well. So I think the thing I particularly recognised with that and with policing in particular was the people side of it. You're dealing with people, and I think I joined the police at the age of 19, quite a naive Sydney North Shore middle class white boy, not knowing much about life, but dealt with people in their best and worst times. Used to say, to see them when they were on drugs they shouldn't have been or weren't on the drugs they should have been, and came to the notice of police, but learned a lot about human interaction and the way they work, which was of great benefit to me later in my career to actually understand people and to take that step back and not just think about enforcing law, but protecting communities. And that, when you take that step back, you actually take a step back, I think, to the foundational principles of policing, what's known as the Peelian principles of policing, that it's by the community, for the community. And policing is best done when you prevent things from happening by building trust with the community and you're part of that community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that trusted connection is really important. And in a society where we're losing trust in all kinds of institutions, I think that makes the policing task harder. So it's actually working with people and being able to stand outside and not excuse poor behaviour, particularly in a policing context, but to understand it is really important. And in most systems I've worked with, working with people when they're scared or when they're grieving or when they have other strong emotions, being able to see the person rather than just the task that you have to complete with them is really, really important and sits behind it. And that's been front and centre in the chaplaincy work, not just trying to fix people, but to be with people. And talk a lot about in the chaplaincy world, the difference between a result and a purpose for our role.
Yep.
And for many people, for those in the medical world, when someone is unwell, their purpose is to make them better. A chaplain's purpose, this idea of pastoral care, that's not the purpose. It's sometimes the result. But our purpose is to sit with, to be with. And sometimes the most difficult thing about disease or grief or stress is you feel like you're alone. To provide a non-judgmental presence, to be with someone in those dark times, to go where they want to go and to be with them, to not go where they don't want to go, don't force them in a direction. Every now and again, just suggest, when people are stuck, a possible way forward or some different ways from your experience. But by and large, to be a person with a person who's going through something terrible. And we recognise that.
Yeah.
Once we've been through a hard time and we say to someone, you were there for me.
Yeah.
Not you fixed my problem. You were there for me.
It's interesting when you're dealing with trauma. I have this conversation all the time. They say, what would you do to fix it? I say, well, you can't, because it's such an individualised thing. Like, 2 people can experience the same event, but will recover and take stuff away from it in 2 totally different ways. And that's what makes it so challenging as well. And I guess that's where that human side comes into it. But I wanted to ask you about the term moral injury, because it's probably a term that's been around for a little while, but it's really now coming into a focus in emergency management. And in a lot of ways, I think it's still misunderstood in our organisations. So I was just going to ask you, if you could sort of explain it to leaders that are encountering the concept for the first time. Try and explain what it actually means.
Yeah. When I start explaining moral injury, I think it's often best to start with that concept of post-traumatic stress that people has become a lot more mainline in understanding that you've been exposed to something that's had not necessarily a physical injury, but it's had more of a psychological, even spiritual, existential wound that you carry as a result of those things. Post-traumatic stress arose in the 1980s after a long chain of different ways in which the same phenomenon was described, whether it was battle fatigue or shell shock or soldier's heart or those different things. There was a price to pay internally for the things we experienced externally. But in the mid-1990s, psychiatrists working with Vietnam veterans said, not sure that post-traumatic stress really plumbs the full depth of what's going on for people. And to put it in more layman's terms, it was more, you've seen something yucky and that's been distressing. You've seen someone when their insides were on their outsides. Now you're distressed about that. And let's see if we can help you to reconfigure the way you're thinking and feeling about that. What post-traumatic stress does, moral injury does, is it takes a bit of a wider view of that interaction and says it's not just what you see, it's quite often the context in which you see it, both the moral context and the organisational context. So, for instance, if a soldier shoots and kills a military-age male in combat, that is stressful and traumatic, but imagine that is a 12-year-old child. Same scenario, they might be shot at by this young child, but then they shoot back and they kill a child. Their moral framework and their code in the world is you don't shoot children.
Yes.
But I just have, even though I had every right in that battle to be able to achieve that, and for my own protection, there's something bent and broken. So sometimes moral injury can be about breaking our own moral framework, that there's things that we have done. That might be for a clinician that you didn't do the procedure that you know you should have done in hindsight and you feel you haven't done the right thing. Another element of moral injury is when we witness other things or we feel we're powerless to stop that. I would think perhaps people might remember the Abu Ghraib prison torture scenes that occurred in Iraq, where the soldiers were torturing prisoners and humiliating them. Those who stood back and witnessed that had this sense of almost being tainted.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. Or you witness other, clinicians give poor treatment or harsh treatment to others. And so you witness it. So this sort of other directed. But another central part of it is this sense of betrayal. So there's almost three flavors of moral injury. This is self-directed, where we become transgressors, that other directed, where we witness things that don't accord with our beliefs. And the other is this sense of betrayal. Jonathan Shea, who was that psychiatrist, said that moral injury arises from betrayal of what's right in legitimate authority, by legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. And so what it does that's different from post-traumatic stress, one of the things it does is it doesn't just say it's a you problem, it says it's an us problem. That actually leadership has a really important part to play in the experience that we have in that workplace. I had a first responder explain to me that they had saved the life of a small child. They'd given CPR and the child had vomited milk into their mouth, and for 6 months they couldn't drink milk.
Yeah. And
their senior leader just said, we should have been wearing your PPE. Not well done. You saved the life of a small child.
Yeah, that's tough.
But it was blameworthy. And there's these stories that go on and on again when people take heroic actions and feel they don't get support.
Yeah.
And so there can be a systems issue at play. Now, this is a great advantage for us in the emergency world because we work in very complex systems and people are in high stress situations.
Yes.
And our default has been like PTSD, and this is where we get into workplace stuff, is to, if there's a problem, it's a problem with the individual. And we say, why is that person sick? Why did that person make a mistake? What moral injury, particularly when we think of it as a workplace stressor, we start to go, what are the factors around that?
Yeah, so looking wider.
That may have caused that. So we look at both. We want to work with individuals, but we also want to work with systems to help us make systems better, to make leadership better and organisational culture more appropriate. One last analogy on this is changing the game this way. It's looking at, imagine you're walking beside a river and a whole bunch of dead fish are floating on the top. And as you walk by, you go, stupid fish. If only they were more resilient. If only they'd eaten better and done some more exercise, they wouldn't have been in trouble and not question the river that they're in.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you might find some fish that are really unwell, you get them out, you scrub them up, you clean them up, you get them healthy, and you put them back into the same river. You're going to get the same results.
Same results, yeah.
post-traumatic stress and the way we've dealt with that largely hasn't thought about that as a context. It's been involved in the periphery. Moral injury, it's very much central to it, not just looking at the individual, but looking at the systems in which they operate. And that's really good because trauma exposure in disaster emergency management isn't a modifiable variable. You can't, as a police officer, paramedic, or a firefighter, go, we're not going to go to something traumatic because that might be distressing. That's in the role description. But the support that you receive back at the station, that very much is something that's within our control. And we can mitigate a lot of that harm, I think, for trauma exposure and also those moral elements that surround it by better organisational systems.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I used to always have a term, after almost 40 years of being involved in this space, I can't remember. Someone was criticising something the firefighters did one day. I can't remember the context, but I just turned around and I said, and my opinion was, you know what? In all my years of service, I've never known a firefighter that turns up to do a bad job. And they just sort of went, I said, we don't. There isn't that capacity to do that, which just sort of leads me into the next question. So in your research that you've done with organisational behaviours and systems, because you've mentioned there about systems, the systems that most commonly create that moral injury, often unintentionally, I guess, what does a psychologically safe emergency organisation look like in practice? And I know that's a really huge question.
Yeah, I think it's really important. In short, it's taking the human side and human factors into account. One of the things I think you just alluded to by saying no firefighter turns up to do the wrong thing. It's the human factor. So the system thinking about this, the systems, the way they impact people in aviation contexts, we recognise human factors, that people make a decision because they thought it was the right thing at that particular time. So we step back and say, well, what were the systems factors that made them think that that was the right thing to do? So considering the human element in it is really important.
Yeah.
Moral injury allows us to see humans as really complex beings as well. And there's this complex interplay between the different elements of who we are. And I unpack this in my book, that we've lost bits of this at times, or we've overemphasized bits. At a first level, we're biological creatures. So if we haven't had sleep, if we don't exercise, if we eat poorly, then we're on a really bad start. And I think those are the foundations on an individual level for us to be able to be well. We can still be unwell, but it's like having a foundations of a house. Without those, it's very hard to have a secure house. Then there's those social elements of connectivity with both our colleagues and our families and our communities. If we don't have that connectivity, we don't get that support that we need through those. And it's not just people that we know, it's people that we trust, people that have our backs, the people that we trust to tell us not nice things about ourselves, but the ones we trust to tell us the things that we need to fix. They're our real friends, the ones that we trust to tell us that. And there has been an increasing understanding of that psychological element, the way we think about those situations, the biases that we might carry in, or the way we have a negativity bias, we can have those kinds of things. And then the other element, which has kind of become a bit scary in a more secular 21st century Australia, is that spiritual element, that unlike other creatures in the world, we ask that question, why? Why did that occur? Why me? And for people with a religious background, even if they're still not religious, why would God let this happen to me? Now, not everyone now thinks through a religious framework, but we all pretty much want to find meaning in our work, meaning in the things that we do and in our relationships that transcend just mere physical transaction. And so I talk about a bio-psycho-social, spiritual way in which we need to understand people's needs. And I think an important element of that spiritual element is that moral element. We're the only creatures also that have more complex moral frameworks. There's deeper sort of philosophy behind that, but understanding that people have a sense of right and wrong, and those need to be attended to. And when they're breached, they hurt us deeply.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
They hurt us.
It's such a challenging space to be in, and I guess one of the things that I'm interested in learning a bit more about in terms of some of the leadership roles that I have in lots of different areas in my life. How can leaders actually recognize those early signs that their people are carrying moral or ethical distress rather than operational stress? Because if I go back to 2003, and I think I've spoken about this before, when I was tasked to undertake our operational debriefs to organise it, and I'm saying, well, I have to be debriefed as well. I was a part of the fires, and so I had to go and get help myself before I could help others. And part of that was actually working out what the best process was. And I was very lucky. I struck it with a really fantastic psychologist, and we decided that we would do a psychological debrief before we did an operational debrief. And that seemed to work quite well. I mean, it didn't fix everything, but it certainly was separated the two, so we could deal with the emotional stuff separately to the operational stuff, so we could get out of the operational side what we needed to continue down. But it also left a big wanting in terms of the emotional side.
Yes. And that's really great to get that support you need. My doctoral research I did across the School of Psychology and the School of Theology. So I did some psychological study, done some theological study, and wanted to blend those two together and actually going, these are greater friends than we might think. And you're asking before about, how do we make a place psychologically safe? And it's worth just being a little bit technical here, because there is a whole range of terms that sound really similar. I think the field of psychology is sometimes a little like McDonald's. It needs to put its prefix on the front, psychological this, psychological that. And so when we talk about psychological safety, that's particularly a theory that's been put forward by and researched a lot by Amy Edmondson at Harvard. And she'll talk about psychological safety is that feeling that you can actually challenge the status quo without having harm to you, the relational element to it.
Yeah, okay, yep.
So if you're my director, Vivian, and I come to you, if I come into the room to you and go, I better be quiet because the boss is here. And if I say anything wrong, then I'm in trouble. I'm likely to get the boot, or it's a career limiting move. But if I go into the room and I go to you, Vivian, this didn't work. Now do it with civility, and this needs to change. And you go, thank you for trusting me with that. That's a sense of psychological safety.
Yes.
Now, creating that is critically important, and I think there's some good frameworks. I'll talk about just cultures in a little minute. But that psychological safety is one element. Another is psychosocial hazards and risks. Now, these are recognizing that there are things in the workplace that can cause psychological harm. Just like we recognize a trip hazard or an electrical hazard can cause physical harm. These are relatively new. The international standard came out in 2021. But they'll say things like excessive workload, lack of leadership support, poor reward or lack of reward or recognition, organisational injustice, bullying. Those different things are different categories that we need to think of like a workplace hazard, and they are a hazard, and then we have to mitigate the risk that they will do harm. And so there's this psychosocial risk and framework. And then there's a broader concept of psychological health and safety, which takes all those elements into account and go, when I go to work, like I need it to be physically safe, will it be psychologically safe? Will it allow me to not be impacted in my psyche and my heart and soul and mind, not just in my body? And so there's this larger framework and legislation in the way we think about those issues as a work health and safety. So leaders now have got both a difficult path to tread, but one actually that's been made more explicit. It's also an opportunity that leaders need to go, I've got to mitigate the risk of poor leadership support. I've got to mitigate the risk of lack of reward or recognition. One of the things I found in my research was that what people perceived as that sense of betrayal or abandonment by their organisation, those particular things, because betrayal is quite an amorphous idea. It's like a cloud. What does it mean? I wanted to work out the specific things that people perceive. A lot of those hazard categories, like poor organisational justice, are perceived as betrayal. So let me give you an example. Recently, the Department of Education in New South Wales launched an investigation, not recently, that's a couple of years ago, launched an investigation against a staff member. They didn't tell the staff member what the allegations were, but they told this particular employee that they were no longer to go back to their workplace, that they would be assigned another work, and they weren't allowed to engage with other people in the workplace.
With no reasoning.
Just you're under investigation.
Wow.
They self-harmed that night, and it was 3 months later they were told the nature of the allegations. So they were told the allegations in April. It was July they got told what the nature of the allegations were. By November, they still had no resolution to those, and the contact was sporadic. Then she complained, this teacher, to Safe Work New South Wales, and within 3 months, so by February, from November to February, they investigated and found they gave 3 improvement notices for a lack of procedural justice. There was no clarity in the system. It was a prolonged investigation over what were ultimately minor things, but high level of stress for this particular person. That wasn't taken. Now, SafeWork handed their investigation down in February the year after. A month after that, the Department of Education Professional Standards handed down their finding. which upheld some of the complaints, but some of them weren't. So it took them 11 months to be able to conclude that. Now, people don't feel that that's fair. There's this sense of betrayal. You're going to have my back. You're going to treat me fairly. In that instance, it appears to me that SafeWork found they didn't treat that person with procedural fairness.
Yeah.
And it was deeply impactful to them. And that was that sense of betrayal. So part of it is clear processes, not just paper processes, because they have a process that says you'll conduct the investigation within 3 months. They didn't. And so Safe Work is looking at these and going, it doesn't matter what your paper says, it matters what you do.
It's
And
interesting.
they didn't do best practice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting because when I was researching this subject, one of the things that they talked about was building systems, which you have alluded to on numerous occasions. And the first thing that kept on coming up was clear boundaries. So people know how to work within those boundaries and a predictable process. So if this happens, then this is what the process is going to be after that. But also other things like fair decision making, transparent communication, consistent leadership behavior. And it sounds like the example that you just talked about, none of that was there. And that makes it really, really challenging for people in that space when they see where they feel like they've been betrayed by their leadership, they're not being supported for the role that they're doing. And you also mentioned about being punished for speaking up and, having that trust where people can say, hey, look, I don't think this is going to work, and being able to stop things happening before they actually occur. And it makes it really challenging. So I guess if there was one thing that you could redesign or one aspect of emergency service leadership culture, is there one thing that we could actually start with to start working on to try and remediate a lot of these things that we're discussing?
Yes, I think there is. But first of all, what I want to say is I think there are a lot of good managers and good leaders out there.
Yes.
And they move into leadership. And certainly when I ask people, as I travel around speaking to different organisations, their intent when they go into leadership is to care for their people. And when you get frontline leadership in the middle there, they're stuck between the organisational demands, even the political demands in emergency management, and the demands and the needs of their people. Now, will they be rewarded for meeting those demands? If you meet your KPIs, they're incentivised to meet KPIs, not to care for people.
Yeah.
They want to care. So I think a lot of middle managers in particular feel this strength, this dissonance, and almost a moral injury between what they want to do, their moral framework, and what they actually have to do. So one thing I would say is there's leaders out there, and I don't want this to be a stupid fish to a stupid fisherman kind of idea where we blame the leaders. Actually, leaders need a great deal of support. And I wish we would use some of that money that we do on individual well-being to make leaders better, to help them to be the leaders they always wanted to be.
Yeah.
Now, one of those elements, particularly around psychological safety, is what seems like a strange question. How do you take criticism and feedback? Because
I actually value it. In fact, in past positions, I've really struggled trying to get my manager to give me that feedback.
We exist in blame frameworks.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to give that critical back. One of my current hot takes at the moment on my issues is after a recent significant event, there was an after-action review in a large organisation, and it was promoted to come along to this after-action review. Don't worry, none of the senior leaders will be there, so you'll be free to speak. And you sit back and go, oh, that's really good, except for the fact you've just admitted that your system is broken, that actually your senior leaders are not capable of being trusted to hear this. Now, there could also be, the perception of people is that they're too high in rank.
Yeah.
But those leaders help create and perpetuate that.
Yeah.
True. I'd like to imagine a world where we go, come to the after-action review. All the senior leaders will be there so that we know this will get directly straight to the top and that action can be taken.
It's funny that you say that, because if I go back to the Black Summer fires, there was a lot of people in the zone that I was working with traumatised, a lot of the divisional commanders and sector leaders and that sort of stuff. So we decided to start at like that middle layer and trying to help them work down through to the brigades and stuff. And so I helped get them in a room. I got two professionals come in that were out of area. So everyone felt comfortable. So we were sitting there in what we call our white shirts, like we were paid staff. We had I think every single person that I invited turned up. because they wanted to participate in this. And then the very first question we asked them was, do you want us to stay or would you prefer us to leave? Because we wanted them to speak openly, honestly. We wanted them to start mapping their recovery process. And we were also quite hard that they said, no, we want you to stay. You were a part of it. And it was at that moment, what you're discussing in terms of that trust. And I just sort of sat back and going, man, and what I witnessed that night, it just would bring you to tears. It was just so heartwarming. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's creating that ability where you're trusted enough to be invited to stay. And there's a whole range of different attributes that are needed in that and particular actions. And
I'd never, ever thought about it in that way until you've now discussed it. I can see it in a very different light now. Yeah.
But recognizing trust is really the currency of leadership, that unless you're trusted, you won't be invited to stay. And it doesn't just happen that people trust you because of rank. And the ADF knows this well in their leadership doctrine. They'll say that actually it's about influence more than about positional authority. And it doesn't take a rank to be a leader.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most important leaders have very little rank.
Very little rank, yeah.
But part of it is also to be able to create that trust is not expecting it. It's to create it. And you only create it through connection and being there. And so I think quite ironically, or, counterintuitively, one of the really important ways of creating trust is to stop having so many jolly meetings. So it's about stopping meeting as much and connecting more.
True.
So Harvard Business Review did an article where they said, well, if you drop meetings by 40%, you increase productivity by 70%.
Okay, I haven't seen that figure, but that's fabulous.
And a guy who is doing this really, really well is a firefighter from New Zealand called Josh Darby, and I can't stop speaking about the work that he's doing. It's in an organisation where there has been high levels of distrust of the senior management, and the perception of the organisation has been very low. He's turned that around and his team in dramatic ways, and one of them was what they called Meeting Free Wednesday, that you don't get your senior leaders don't meet any Wednesday, and they go and they are with their staff. They're not trying to do an agenda and just by slight, having little meetings of ticking off agenda items, just to be with people, to get to know their name, to get to know what's important to them.
Yeah.
And it increases people's willingness to engage, and it changes the relationship and goes, I'm not just the assistant commissioner, I'm Bob that's known by people. And there's a position, there's a need for command and control, but a rewiring of our perception of what it is to lead. And it's not just to do the tasks, it's to be engaged with those that we lead.
Yeah. It's interesting, with any sort of relationship, you quite often hear people say it's the little things that count. And it's those little things that just add to the ladder of building up to that trust. Yeah. So with your doctoral work, I know it explores moral injury in emergency organisations, but I'm really interested in terms of your research. Was there one thing that surprised you most that you found that you're quite surprised about?
There was a few things, but I think one of the, in some ways, a niche kind of finding, but this is actually important, is that in emergency services and disaster world, we love to give medals and commendations to people, and how morally injurious that is to many people, which is counterintuitive. I wasn't expecting that.
Okay.
So I'll give you some examples that might help unpack that. A paramedic who performed the first of its kind treatment on site saved the person's life. Then they were complained about as a result of that. They were told that there was an investigation. They weren't allowed to give their side and their version of the account. It was in complete secret, and it was for months and months. And then someone rang them up and said, oh, yeah, that's all gone now. We want to give you a medal for it.
Okay.
And he went, another first responder who, in Victorian bushfire history, there's been numbers of big ones, but in one of those, they did 13 body recoveries from bushfires. That's not nice. They worked 12 days straight. One day, a few months later, they go into the station, and the roster guy worked really hard, got a medal. And he said, how come you got a medal? He said, well, if you worked 14 days straight, you got a medal.
Yes.
And I didn't want a medal, but that seems patently unfair, not to diminish the valuable work that people in rosters do, but the arbitrariness of that.
Yeah.
Or another one who got their long service and good conduct medal through the internal post at the start of their shift, and they just threw it in their locker and went, if someone had just said thanks, that would have been better. Or there's sometimes the rite of passage that once someone attains a certain rank, you just get a fire service medal or an ambulance service medal or a police service medal or an emergency service medal as due course. And it feels like those in senior leadership get them merely by rank. And rank has been earned, I'll admit that, but there becomes a degree of suspicion in people. And so they're just like 4 different examples.
There is, I find that really interesting, and I shouldn't laugh, but because I was given the Australian Fire Service Medal in 2004, and being a woman in a male-dominated environment, I get asked all the time, but what did you do? I just, wow. It got to the point where I just stopped using it. In fact, there was one work environment that I was actually told not to use my nominals after my name, and so it's a very vexed issue.
It is.
Yeah, and I think there is a huge misunderstanding about the medal system. And the honour system, I should call it.
And actually, just what you just said, that the honour system was one of the things that one guy in particular talked about. He mentioned a number of things about a police officer who got shot. And the police officer who got shot or stabbed, I think it was stabbed actually, was given a very high level commendation. The other officer who came in to the guy attacking him and defended him off got a lower level of bravery because he wasn't as badly injured. Now, the level of bravery was high. It was actually higher in that officer because the other one was attacked without his knowledge. Brave, police officers are brave. But this one knowingly went in and fought someone with a knife and saved a colleague. Or the officer saying he did this particular rescue and it was traumatic. It was the single most traumatic day of his life. And then someone in a back office recreated that story, didn't run it past him, and then he stood in front of the headlights and got awarded this bravery medal to a story that he didn't recognise and saying, I'm getting awarded for bravery when it was the day I was most terrified. And what we've tended to do is make medals about the organisation, not about the individual. And we don't ask them their consent. We don't see it as a well-being and safety issue. We see it as a protocol issue. And most medals are done by protocol. And so
it definitely is a system that's not very well understood.
So I think it's vital, but it's because I started to rally on this to my wife and said, we shouldn't do medals. It's so stupid. And when I started to see this, she said, no, but this is really important to me as well, because it says the sacrifices that I made were important and they're worthy to be awarded. Well, okay, you're right. And so I think we just need to do it better with more of that human element in it.
Yes.
Rather than organisational glory.
And I'll probably get my head cut off by saying this. I know I've seen people that have been very critical of people that have got the national medal, like the award for service, years of service, I should say. And there's people that have been the secretary, let's say, for instance, a secretary of a brigade for the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, would have never been on the fire ground. They've never been operational, but they've been a part of it. And there's a lot of angst and say, why do you get that? Because you've never taken the risks. And it's really quite interesting. I don't know what the right outcome is, but maybe it's time that the whole honour system gets a good once over. And look at it.
I think it's really essential, but it surprised me. And I was in a room of people giving a presentation and it kept getting interrupted because people were being disciplined. And then afterwards we started talking about medals and the room just went electric. And I could not believe it.
It's funny because they either love it or they hate it.
Yeah. Well, one guy said, I'm owed 2 medals. And he said, I'm not letting any of those so-and-so's give it to me. That's the reason I don't want them. That's the reason I don't want them. And they said, well, okay, well, we can organise something locally and recognise you. So, okay, I'd do that, but I don't want anyone. And look, at my own experience, I know it's a big bureaucracy, but an organisation I've worked for as as a first responder asked me on their system how I wanted to be awarded a medal. I said, by my local commander. And then they completely ignored that and posted it to me. Not that I wanted it, but it was just, okay, what was the point?
Yeah, I actually had the opposite. I got into big trouble because after the Black Summer fires, of course, they awarded a medal. And I worked very closely with the team. We were 8 months working on these fires. And I was actually working in a different industry at the time, an hour and a half away from where they were presenting medals. I just completely forgot about the medal ceremony because, I was working with a lot of vulnerable people at that time in the job that I was doing. And I just completely forgot. And it wasn't until like 2 days later, they rang me and said, where were you, Vivian? You were the only one that didn't show up. You had to be there. You were part of the team. And I'm going, sorry.
Mm. And
It just completely slipped my mind. I just was so focused on what I was doing. And I felt really bad. But
isn't it a pity that blame was the first thing that was jumped to? You had to be, there was probably a really good reason why you weren't there.
Yeah. Well, I just, that was the job I was doing at the time. And I wasn't working in the same industry. So it's not say, hey, I've got to leave work now for a couple of hours to go and get a medal sort of thing.
Yeah.
The industry I was working didn't support, well, that wasn't a part of the work.
But what if they'd rung up and said, you missed a really important day. That must have been pretty serious for you. Do you need any support?
Yeah.
That would have changed the conversation a bit.
My first thought was, well, you didn't ring and remind me, did you?
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, we digress. At the flip side of that, I just want to ask you, is there one myth about being in the emergency management space in terms of our well-being that you wish we could actually retire for good? And we've sort of touched on that a little bit.
I think one that needs significant reworking is this idea of resilience, which has become like PTSD and individual. The evidence for resilience isn't great. And I think people have got over that word a little bit, but this idea of we need to make our workforce more resilient. And I want to ask the question, well, what do they have to be resilient to?
Yeah.
Are they having to be resilient to the traumatic work, or are they having to be resilient to the organisation? And then actually using kind of work health and safety frameworks to go, how do we make our systems more robust and safer? And that's then the interaction between individual vulnerabilities and risks mitigation strategies. And so I think in some ways I'd like to hear the retirement of that phrase resilience and start talking about collaborative workplace design.
Yeah. Well, that sort of makes sense because I hear a lot of pushback now when people say resilience and even a lot of pushback for, we've got to get back to normal, and people have challenged, well, what's normal? There is no, you've got to do the new normal. And there's a lot of pushback even on that term. You're right. We've got to broaden our outlook and look at things differently.
Yeah, and that's not to say that individuals don't have vulnerabilities, but it's a different way of looking at it than just going, "Oh, are you resilient enough? Let's roll out another 2-day workshop on resilience, and that will fix the workplace." It doesn't appear to have done that much over the last number of years. The claims for psychological health are not going in the right direction.
It's so true because through the leadership training that I've done over the years, especially through experiential learning leadership, the one thing you learn is you never assume anything. Because as soon as you make an assumption, you've locked yourself out of lots of different answers or avenues that you could take.
And curiosity is a really key skill.
Yeah.
And I think leaders shy away from this, but people like Mark Crosswell are doing a good job in getting us to rethink about compassion. I've done a bit of work with some hostage negotiators and done some reading around that. And it's surprising what are the most important skills and attributes of someone who's a good hostage negotiator.
Compassion.
It's empathy. And active listening.
Yeah.
Empathy and actively. So empathy, compassion, let's call them the same thing. And Chris Voss, who's former head FBI negotiator, talks about this need for empathy, and males tend to not like it, so he calls it tactical empathy. But empathy, he says, you don't go to a hostage negotiation and say, we'll split the difference. You have two, we'll have two, and we'll call it a day. You go, I want all four of them, and I want to give you nothing. And he goes, actually, the key to is understanding why have they taken them? Who is this person I'm dealing with? And that means asking questions and listening to people. And as leaders, we sometimes can believe that I'm now in the position to tell people what to do, whereas you're actually in a better position to hear what people need.
Yeah, so true. So if every leader listening to this podcast that's in the emergency management space and you could change one behaviour tomorrow, what would that be?
It's to listen more and talk less.
I thought that would dovetail really quite well into what you were just saying about that active listening.
It's to listen, and it's to ask the right kinds of questions of people. Not what were you thinking when you did that? What were the factors that led to that? What are the things that you need from me to achieve your job? What are the roadblocks that are in the way? What's giving you the most energy? What are the things that are constraining you from doing the job that you need to do? How can I move them? And then go and investigate and report back whether or not you can or can't do anything about it. And there's nothing worse telling your boss, well, this is what we need to do, And they go, okay, boss goes and looks, has a look at it and go, I can't do anything about that, and never reports back. Well, I actually did take you seriously, and here's why we can't. This is the roadblock I'm finding in being able to tackle that, and that open honesty, but that curiosity to ask questions and to listen to the answers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was doing the job for a while when I was working with very vulnerable people. I did it for quite a few years. And these vulnerable people were quite often coming out of jail or had committed crime, and we were assisting them to prepare for court, interviewing, doing reports, all sorts of things. And we had a bit of a map that we used to follow. Well, what were you like 1 month before? And then we get to 1 week before the offence. And then we get to 3 days before the offence and an hour before the offence. So we were trying to map how they ended up at that point. Because it wasn't just what you're saying is, it wasn't just you committed the offence, you broke the law. We wanted to understand the whole context that came before that. And I've never really thought about it in the terms that you're describing it at the moment. And to me, that really makes a lot of sense.
It's really important to understand the factors impacting on people when they do, in a workplace, the wrong thing. Criminals, when they do things, we don't solve things by making broad assumptions that they shouldn't have done it. It's not to excuse poor behaviour, but it is to understand it and also to recognise, particularly in the workplace and emergency operators, like you said about the firefighters, they didn't go there to do the wrong thing.
No,
They thought it was the right thing.
Turn up to do a bad job.
And so how do we deal with those things that got us to make a bad decision? So, for instance, this idea of just cultures is really important. Sidney Decker, who's the main Australian scholar on this from Griffith University, gives an example where a nurse does a double shift. Then they're asked to come back the next morning and they get 6 hours sleep. They come back. And at their hospital, they had a procedure where nurses would give the initial doses of anaesthesia, gave the wrong dose of the wrong drug to a child who subsequently died. She was immediately stood down, then fired and deregistered. And after 4 years of trying to get back, died by suicide. Nowhere was the organisation held accountable for having systems that were fatal for fatigue management. It was all placed on the individual. She put the wrong drug into the wrong person. There was no doubt about that. But the factors that led to that, if you'd have taken away the fatigue, if you'd have changed the system so it was impossible to do that, you'd have avoided a death. And whether or not those were sufficiently investigated and changed, I doubt. You ask many nurses about fatigue management and I bet you they would say that's often not dealt with properly.
Yeah, no, there's so much in this space, and it's been amazing having this conversation with you. If there was one question that you wish more leaders would ask themselves to sort of dovetail into everything that we've spoken about today, what would that question be?
Ask of themselves. There's lots of questions I can think of, but I've got to get one, don't I?
Space, and I know it's a really hard thing to do, but I guess what I'm trying to do is to try and give something to everyone that would listen to this podcast to go away and think about. Give them something to put into their toolbox that they can walk away and really make them think and reflect about what they've done in the past, how they can move forward in the future, how can we address a lot of the issues that we're talking about. So I guess I'm dumbing it down to one very simple line, but is there one thing that we can give them to take away?
I think it's what's my unique contribution that I can have improved by the end of my career. And I say that because when we look at all the issues in large emergency organisations, they feel like an elephant. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
One bite at a time.
And I think if we can go, actually, I could improve just one element and I don't have to fix it overnight. We tend to work on a news cycle and an election cycle, but history works in decades and centuries. What is one thing that you think you could make better over your career and then work towards that? And if everyone worked towards one thing, the total sum of that would be really quite amazing. So it's what's the one, and so how am I gifted and skilled? We're not all gifted and skilled the same way. We've all got different contributions to make, but what will be my unique contribution to make one thing better in my career?
It's really quite interesting that you say that, because I remember quite a few years ago, I went for, it was my dream job, but it was a job I really felt that I could really excel at and, provide a lot to. And the very first question they asked me was, what's your X factor? Totally threw me. I knew the job inside out. I knew the legislation inside out. I knew all the leadership. I knew the people, everything about it just dovetailed into what I wanted to do and what I wanted to achieve and where I wanted to go. Had never considered a question like that. And I just totally lost the interview after that point because I'd never actually sat there and thought about what could I personally bring to that position. And that was such a steep learning curve for me. This sort of ties in with what you're saying there about, what is that one thing that you can improve on and make better to start chipping away for the future. Yeah.
And, once you tap on that golden nugget, there's lots of little things that fall out of it that give you little tasks to help you to achieve that.
Well, I went back to my trusted network and I said, what's my X factor?
Yeah.
So I've got to start thinking about this and trying to understand it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. I found this conversation absolutely fascinating, and you've really prompted my thinking in a lot of different areas. I do have one final question that I quite often ask people, and I try and ask every guest this same question. And again, it's a bit about reflection. So when everything else falls away, the roles, the expectations, and the pressure that we all face in this human side of emergency management, what remains at the core and what drives your leadership in this space?
I think what drives my leadership is to help other people achieve the goals that they're trying to make. Employ people to do management roles in all kinds of different elements of business. And it's when I know what it is that I want to change, it's actually to make people reach their potential and achieve the goals together as a team. And if I can enable and unlock that, and so it becomes less of a focus on me, because that's what I want to do. The thing I want to achieve in the next couple of years is people stop treating each other badly in the workplace.
Yeah.
And to find forgiveness and reconciliation in the workplace. And that only happens when you start concentrating on what other people need. And all of a sudden, people will die for you rather than forcing them to their early graves. They'd die for you.
Yeah.
It changes the calculus when you can build that trust and loyalty. And you don't have to tell people to do stuff because they want to do it.
Absolutely.
Because you're not self-focused, and it's the great irony when you try and force people to do things, they resist. When you help them to do their things, they help you do what you want to do.
It's interesting because the people that I've worked with in this space over the last 39, 40 years, there's a handful that I know would go to the ends of the earth for me, and I would do the same for them because we've actually developed that trust through exceptionally trying and stressful and traumatic situations, but we've got that trust because we had each other's backs. And to this day, don't see them as often as what I'd like, but we know we're always there in the background to assist each other whenever we need it.
Yeah, and it's great that when you've got people, I've got your back.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's highly valuable looking at all these different concepts and putting it into context in terms of the human side of emergency management. So thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me. Been a pleasure.